We addressed this from the White House. I know there have been questions and concerns about this, but there is no indication of aliens or extraterrestrial activity with these recent takedowns. Again, there is no indication of aliens or terrestrial activity with these recent takedowns. Wanted to make sure that the American people knew that, all of you knew that, and it was important for us to say that from here because we've been hearing a lot about it.
Stand up.
From a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA, this is Stand Up with Pete Dominic. On today's episode, giving your teenager lots of individual freedoms while fastening their new OM400 ankle bracelet. And now, the podcast host who, like Liam Neeson, has a very particular set of skills like podcasting from a garden shed, Pete Dominic!
Yes, that is right. It is me. Thank you very much, Peteko. He is... bastard. What he's referencing there is the Liam Neeson movies Taken, and he is trying to get under my skin because, of course, tonight is when Ava leaves for Europe. And if she gets taken, apparently I've got a special set of skills to go get her back. And so thank you, Peteko, because not concerned at all. Honestly, I'm really not. I'm excited for her. Ava goes to Spain today, 18 years old. She's going off to see her friends from camp that are Spaniards. Live in Barcelona, and I'm very excited for her. She's going there for a week for her break, her winter break, and it's going to be an amazing, amazing trip for her, and we're all very excited. Okay, so that means tomorrow's show, by the way, is going to be a special episode, Gen Series, inspired by wanting to get to know what my daughter's generation is facing and dealing with. I started this series a couple of weeks ago with Lucy Solomon. If you know somebody who is Gen Z, who is doing good things, passionate, articulate, good at talking, and wants to talk to me, send them my way. Our guest tomorrow comes from Odessa, my intern, who of course is Gen Z, and comes highly recommended from my daughter, who also went to camp with her. And I will be interviewing a junior at Marquette University. Hope Moses is her name. She is my guest tomorrow. Very excited, and I think you're going to love that conversation. That's tomorrow. But today, I've got two excellent guests joining me. The great Bill B in D.C., Bill Boyle, is first, and after that, I've got the founder and president of the Public Religion Research Institute, the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Robbie Jones is joining me again. And most importantly, I've got you. I've been hearing from a lot of listeners lately sending me some super thoughtful emails, and I just want to say how grateful I am to hear from so many listeners and how important it is to me to hear from you, and so thoughtful. So thank you. Keep the emails coming. Keep the feedback coming. Ideas, criticisms, compliments, whatever you want to send it over to me at standupwithpete@gmail.com. Sign up for a paid subscription if you haven't. This is a completely independent media outlet created by me for us to figure out what the hell is going on in the world and in our lives. And hey, let's check in with the news right now. Everybody is talking about all these different foreign objects, UFOs, that have been shot down, including, you just heard from the president's spokeswoman, KJP, as they call her, who said there's no indication of aliens or extraterrestrial activity with these recent takedowns, which is exactly what an alien would want her to say. We're all very disappointed. We all really are hoping that it's some kind of alien visiting us, but not the case, folks. Apparently not. Some people think this story is undercovered. Some people think it's getting plenty of coverage. But is it, Ohio? 1 million pounds of vinyl chloride were on this train that derailed last week. Vinyl chloride, of course, not only flammable, but it's apparently not good for the human body. Brain, lung, blood, and liver carcinogen. Authorities decided to burn hundreds of thousands of gallons of this chemical after the train derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. Has it got enough news coverage? The Ohio River Basin now is being apparently affected by this. 25 million people live there, and this is, according to some people, one of the deadliest environmental emergencies in decades. So is it getting enough coverage? Are we paying enough attention to that? Fair question. Rescuers saved a 13-year-old boy from under a collapsed building a week after Turkey's deadliest modern-day earthquake killed tens of thousands of people. As the chances of finding other survivors dwindled, the teenager spent 182 hours under the concrete, held a rescuer's hand Monday as he was placed on a stretcher and covered for warmth before he was moved in an ambulance. And apparently the rescue phase is coming to a close in the Turkey-Syria quake disasters. These stories of miraculous rescues have been flooding the airwaves in recent days, but tens of thousands of dead have also been found, with the toll expected to sharply rise. More than 37,000 people declared dead. That's the number I could find here as I go to post this on Monday night. I saw this and wanted to share this report from the CDC, where researchers are reporting that teenage girls in the United States are, quote, engulfed in a growing wave of violence and trauma, showing increases in rape, suicidal thoughts, and record levels of feeling sad or hopeless. Nearly 15% of teen girls reported that they were forced to have sex, an increase of 27%. And the first increase since the CDC began tracking it. 30% of the teen girls said they have seriously considered suicide, up nearly 60% over the past 10 years. 57% of teen girls said they felt, quote, persistently sad or hopeless, double the rate of boys and highest in a decade. The CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey is done every 2 years based on data collected from nationally representative sample of students in public and private high schools. I just highly recommend that you check in with your teenage daughters and their social media use. It's no different than it is for us, except we have a better ability to kind of understand it. But this fear of missing out, this constant comparison of others, is definitely contributing to a lot of this, and I highly recommend that you just keep a watch on your girls, as we have, and it's not easy, but you got to try to strike the right balance and keep the communication open. I don't know what else to say about that. And one of the big news stories regarding the former disgraced President Donald Trump, a new report from the Washington Post is detailing a previously unknown element of the former president's 2020 his obsessions with the election, describing a comprehensive research project that he commissioned to develop proof of election fraud, and his response when the consultants that he hired failed to find the smoking gun he so fervently desired. He, of course, has made no secret of desire to throw out the results from 2020 election and declare himself the winner. He's never wavered from his baseless claims of election fraud, throws his endorsement support almost exclusively behind other candidates who indulge his election denialism, and he's gone so far as to call for the termination of the U.S. Constitution. Let's not forget about that, as well as his role in inspiring the Capitol rioters of January 6th. And according to Washington Post Josh Dawsey, the Trump campaign paid a research company, Berkeley Research Group, through a subsidiary, totaling more than $600,000 in the final weeks of 2020. What do they get for the money? Where a dozen researchers were apparently involved, who used statistics to model and predict outcomes in at least a dozen hypotheses? Nothing. They looked at everything. Everything. Literally anything you could think of. Voter turnout anomalies, date of birth anomalies, whether dead people voted. There was anything under the sun they could be thought of. They looked at it and they found nothing. Nothing that would affect the outcome of any state's election. And that has legal consequences, because the more evidence that he knew there was no evidence that the election outcome was in question, the more he looks like a criminal. So I think that's pretty big news, too. And one more terrible story. Multiple people injured at Michigan State University after shootings at 2 locations were reported on the East Lansing campus. And today marks 5 years since the Parkland High School shooting that killed 17 people, mostly students. Shout out to Barry Hummel in Parkland and to Matt Carlson in Lansing, 2 listeners just off the top of my head that are obviously affected by both those situations. And finally, speaking of Dr. Barry Hummel, this is his congressman. His name is Jared Moskowitz of the 23rd District of Florida, which includes Parkland. And he did an amazing job yesterday on the Oversight Committee. This is actually from last week, but I just saw this clip where they seem to only want to talk about Hunter Biden's laptop. But what about the more than 60% rise in anti-Semitic tweets on Twitter. Anyway, here he is. I thought this is a great clip. I wanted to share it. I'm not even familiar with this guy. He's a brand new congressman, and I'm going to try to get him on the show, but here it is.
There's been a 66% increase of anti-Semitism on Twitter since Elon Musk set it free. Mr. Chairman, I agree with you. It's not fair to say all conservatives are Nazis. That's preposterous. That's not true. But your Lord and Savior Donald Trump is having tea and dinner with them at Mar-a-Lago. Nick Fuentes right here, who is a picture that is tweeted at me all the time saying Jews are a virus in response to my tweets. Donald Trump's having dinner with him. Nazis at Mar-a-Lago. And so, no, not all Republicans are Nazis, but I got to tell you, Nazis seem really comfortable with Donald Trump. So I have questions about that, Mr. Chairman. Why is that? Why do I get these tweets? Let's talk about Kanye West, right? The chairman of the Judiciary Committee for 3 months praising Kanye West. We love Kanye, right? A Nazi. Clearly now. It took months for that tweet to come down. How come? I mean, these are things I'd love to know. Is it because maybe they're your voters? I mean, they certainly aren't voting for me. I yield back.
All right, there's a lot more to that clip, by the way, that I highly recommend you watch. Congressman Jared Moskowitz, we'll try to get him on the show. All right, well, that's what I've got for you in terms of news here at the top. Who was it yesterday that emailed me, said, I'm still glad you're doing a short news segment at the top of the show. Thank you very much to all of those of you who do appreciate that. I try to do it every day. I don't always get to it, but you're welcome. It does take a lot of work to get that into the show. But now it's time to get to my guest. The bread and butter, the value of this show is the fact that I get the best, smartest people in the world to talk to me every day. Usually two people, sometimes one people, sometimes one person. Anyway, today I've got both Robbie Jones and Bill B in D.C. coming at you right now. He was a longtime listener and caller of the old show. He's this businessman, business owner, parking garages down in D.C., but he seems to know everybody and everything that is going on. And we love when he joins us here on the show at the Hangouts. We got him. It's at Bill B in D.C. Let's go. We haven't even seen you at one of the last two listener-subscriber Hangouts. You're always someone we love to hear from, but you've been skipping.
I've had a social life, unfortunately, that takes me away from the Hangout, sadly.
Wow, I'm not sure that's allowed to have an actual traditional social life, meaning you go out and see people.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, my wife has a social life that she drags me along with, which is nice. So, well, I'm happy to have you here back on the pod. Lots of things I want to ask you about. First of all, you probably have some thoughts, some views on shooting down UFOs. There's been like 4 of them. There's been a lot of talk. They've said that they're definitely not aliens. I heard a couple of interviews where people from the administration and others said they're definitely not necessarily Chinese. So let's not get carried away. But what do we need to know? And one listener even said you should ask Bill about this. What does Bill B think about UFOs being shot down over Montana? I don't think they have been, and I don't think if UFOs were here, I don't think we would ever see them. And I think it's an absurd idea to imagine that if a intelligence was smart enough to get here, which is such an unbelievable technological achievement alone, that us seeing them would be, or not us not ever seeing them would be child's play in comparison. So yeah, I don't think the UFO stuff, I don't believe any of it. I think it's anomalous things that happen, or Chinese or Russian balloons. And that's kind of it. I don't buy any of the BS.
But I'm almost saying UFO in that they're not sure exactly what the objects were at a couple of these instances.
Well, right. So I think that you're hearing of different form factors, right? The huge Chinese balloon with the platform and that it can steer itself, and then it's got solar panels and all that. Then there's the one where it's like an octagonal balloon. It looks like metallic with potentially a payload, inside of it. You're hearing, and by the way, they were talking about 4, but actually one of them was one they sighted in Montana and they shot it down over Michigan. So there's so much wild talk out there. There were 3 in total that were shot down, as far as I understand. And, by the way, like you or I with $10,000 could build an octagonal metallic balloon
and put it in the air and let it go. Right? I mean, this is not anything that's really high tech in any serious way. So these balloons that came from China, at least one of them, the main big one, came from China.
Yeah, they admitted to it, basically. They were mad that we shot it down. Yeah, so we know that one. Yeah.
Right. And they have been sighted off of Costa Rica, off of our American bases out in the Pacific, off of the Philippines, et cetera. Those balloons, at least, they're definitely Chinese government. They're definitely there to soak up signals intelligence, meaning when American military units are moving around, they want to listen to the pattern of their encrypted communications, because that gives them a sense of our reaction time, of the dispersal of forces, of our command structure, all that sort of thing. Almost all U.S. military communication is highly encrypted. So the chances even that they're really able to listen in on conversation is quite low, actually. Although I wouldn't put it past them. Put a lot of effort into this. The interesting thing about it, though, is that this is, and I was just talking to someone about this, it's a really low-tech kind of way to do things. And it's obviously got really blatant problems with it, like the fact that something goes wrong and now you have a balloon above Northern America right before you've agreed to have a meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State. You've done it in such an egregious and obnoxious way that they have to shoot it down. Otherwise, there's a huge political firestorm in America that hurts the president. And so now you've just embarrassed your own country. You've also looked super aggressive and inept at the same time. And that's a big deal, because if you're China and you're throwing hard elbows at the Philippines, Japan, at South Korea, everybody, the aggressive part really pisses people off and it worries them, right? But the inept part should not be underestimated, because the inept part means that these countries also say, these guys are kind of dumb. And maybe they're really not up to taking on the Americans ever again. And so it's the worst of all possible worlds for China, because it shows that they had bad control over this program. It wasn't particularly high tech, and it was like needlessly, stupidly aggressive. And so that fits into every American critique of China's attempted wolf warrior diplomacy rise in the world. It fits every single one perfectly. The U.S. couldn't have hoped for better. And by the way, I'm somebody who will tell you, when the Trump administration didn't shoot these balloons down that were sort of marginally near U.S. territory, that was the right thing to do, because we spy on China. We also work the corners and do that sort of thing ourselves, right? That's kosher. That's how the game is played. But when the Biden administration found this balloon going where it was going, they had to shoot it down. But think about what they did. It was quite adroit. They let the balloon come all the way into the U.S. They jammed its signals, right, so that it couldn't receive signals, which is why a balloon that was steerable, you watch it from Canada all the way to the Carolinas, it sat right in the wind stream. Now, that balloon can steer. It can go up. It can go down. It can pick up variable winds and go in almost any direction, right? Because the winds are going in different directions based on the height of the atmosphere. But the Chinese couldn't, because we jammed it, right? Which, by the way, is probably why they were partly pissed. They probably could have steered it to the Arctic and we would have let them. But then you shoot it down over 40 feet of water in American territorial waters, right into the hands of your waiting dive team, who's going to pick up the payload, which will show them exactly what China was looking for, exactly what China did know they were getting, didn't know, etc. So this turned into not just an embarrassment for China, but like a real intelligence loss. And what it also did, NORAD has now altered the filters on all of their radars. This is why they're suddenly finding all these little balloons, because they didn't think it was important before. They didn't realize, I think, quite what they were doing. And so now, like, say if you were China and you were going to go to war with us next year, you were foolish to do this now, because then you're not going to have this capability, right? So just all around a total fuck up. China screwed up completely. My theory on this is that Xi in China was sort of going away from confrontation with the U.S. And maybe some parts of the People's Liberation Army wanted to stop that. And so they spiked the punch.
Good theory.
That's totally a theory. It's completely a theory, but I don't know why in God's name they would have done anything remotely like this at the moment that it happened otherwise.
Xi is making too nice. We must launch the balloon plan.
Well, yeah, and by the way, like, this is not just like sort of, oh, we really want to invade Taiwan. This is about programs, money, power, everything. The guys who are on the military side, if they decide to go away from invading Taiwan, they lose relative power in that society, right? So there's, real bureaucratic infighting that happens here that is much more powerful than any. That's what politics in China are, in effect. Popular politics mean almost nothing. So it's these interest groups vying for various resources and the ability to make demands and get what they want. And it seems to be pretty incredibly convenient.
The only reason why that
this happened.
The only flaw upon that hypothetical about maybe, challenging or undercutting Xi was that apparently that this program, I read somewhere that this program was being carried out in several different countries as well. But that doesn't mean it's not true. It's just a theory anyway. But I mean,
right. By the way, it could be North Korea. It could be Russia. If I had to bet, it would be Russia with the janky lame balloons that were floating around that we barely bothered to shoot down. It could be a bunch of countries. It could be balloons that have nothing to do with any of this.
Right.
Yeah. But the big fat balloon that we shot down, it's either one of the biggest fuck ups in modern Chinese history, or it was a fuck up in modern Chinese history, in quotes.
Okay, let's talk about the State of the Union last week. Everybody's giving 80-year-old Joe Biden huge marks for rope-a-doping Republicans into supporting Medicare and Social Security. That was a pretty brilliant move for being prepared for the Republican onslaught of heckling and just the worst kind of yelling and screaming that we've ever seen in our lifetimes at a State of the Union. What are your thoughts on the reactions to the speech itself, what, if anything, it means?
Well, so, it's funny because, as you know, I normally never watch this stuff. But my kid wanted to watch it, so we put it on and sat there. And I was profoundly surprised by it. Biden went in there, and as you said, he rope-a-doped these guys. He ran them out of their shoes, basically, in the way he did his speech. And what was really important about it to me, or what was interesting, is that, when Joe Wilson said, "You lie," to Obama, that was like such an offense to the chamber, and it was such a shocking thing. And Republicans, Democrats voted to give him an official reprimand when he did it, actually. I think that part of the reason that was so much of a bigger deal than in this last one, where it was far more raucous and far more back and forth, is that Obama was a black president who was very sure to demand deference to the dignity of the presidency as a black man, which put him in a different position where he couldn't have done what Biden did, where Biden was literally like, bring it, keep doing this. Well,
there's some truth to that.
Yeah, and there's a strategy there, which is Biden knows these guys look like assholes when they do it. And he was actually, you could tell he was relishing it. And if you watch, I wasn't even looking at Biden's face, I was looking at McCarthy's face.
Yeah.
Because McCarthy looked like a guy who brings like a girlfriend to his nice Christian parents' house, her Christian parents' house, or his Christian parents' house, excuse me, and she starts like F-bombing the whole time. Like he just looked like, like you could feel like he, and of course he doesn't have the power to tell these people to shut the fuck up, but he clearly wanted to. Well, and what was amazing about it, Biden could not have taken more advantage of that if he tried. And it kind of tells you that maybe him running in 2024 is not such a bad idea.
I think it's a bad idea because I'll just say it. I think it's a bad idea because he could have a stroke tomorrow and it would be like, that would be it. It's such a risky endeavor, I think. But, who are
you going to bet on, Trump or Biden having a stroke first? I think I'll take that bet.
I don't know. It's a good question. Biden's getting his physical this week. Apparently, we're going to hear more about his health, which I think is going to be important and interesting. But let me just push back on you and everybody who is saying that they made themselves look badly. These Republicans who behaved badly made themselves look badly, because every time I hear somebody saying that, I'm like, to who? To their supporters. They did exactly what they want. Cruelty is the point, rudeness, owning the libs, fuck the president, fuck Joe Biden, Right. All of that, they've got it on their cars, their trucks, their T-shirts. That's what they did. They were rude. And so their supporters want them to be like that, I'd argue.
But what is this about? In the end, what do we want? What do we need to do? We need to win elections.
They'll continue to win their elections through that behavior is what I'm saying.
Right, but they lost the last election. They made almost no gains in the House, particularly because of that behavior. They drive away people in the middle. They drive away moderate conservatives. You and I talk about this. My friends that used to be movement conservatives, they won't fucking vote Republican. They won't. And it's exactly, I was texting some of these guys that night, and they're watching this, and they're just going like, Jesus Christ, these clowns. People want their government to have some dignity. I personally don't mind it if there's some back and forth. But the Republicans that's not back and forth. That's just, as you said, playing to their grossest part of their base.
Yeah.
And Pete, I'm telling you, if they were not that kind of party, they would have won the House easily. They would have won the Senate in the last cycle easily. And they would have won in 2020 for the presidency easily. They're giving up seats left and right because they do that stuff, because they drive away that 6 or 7% in the middle. And that's it. So if they keep doing it, I'm more than happy with it. I'm fine because it's not hurting us.
And have you been paying attention to these congressional hearings where they've also been making, I think, pretty much asses of themselves in so many different hearings that we've been seeing Republicans?
Right. I mean, I watch it a tiny bit. I watch some highlights of it.
Yep.
It's all bullshit. I mean, it's ridiculous. Nobody buys it. No one thinks it's good. I mean, what if anything has come out of this that has been a revelation? I don't know, except maybe to Matt fucking Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald and John Turley. Again, these are the assholes talking to the assholes. That's it. And so it doesn't change anything. And because they're so clearly just red tooth partisans, it doesn't do any good to them. I mean, I think it honestly has hurt them. Honestly hurt them.
Any thoughts about the almost 40,000 people who have died in Turkey and Syria? Have you been paying any attention to that horror?
Yeah, quite a bit. I've actually been to within about 50 miles of Antakya, which is the city that was the epicenter. Maybe 100 miles away from it, actually. So I know Turkey in that direction kind of, I've been there and I've driven it and been around. It's a lot of sort of 5, 6, 8-story cinder block apartment buildings, with rebar sticking out of the roofs. And that, by the way, is a weird little anecdote that when we were first there, we drive past these places and they all have rebar sticking up the top floor.
Yeah.
And I was kind of snickering man, I can't believe they don't just finish these things off very well.
Yeah.
That rebar is optimism. It's the idea that they might want to add another floor later.
It reminds me of Sicily.
Yeah. It's optimism. Maybe when we have a kid, we add another floor to this place.
Yeah.
And it's those little subtle things in a place like that where when you see it, it looks like just messy, but it's actually a thing that tells you sort of their way of looking at life.
We're coming back to this. We're not done here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And
that's, by the way, how every single outdoor project in my house is.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, mine's not optimism. Mine's lazy. Finishing.
That too. Yeah.
But it really, the Turks are really good people. I like Turkey. I love the Turks. They have a corrupt government that wasn't enforcing the building codes. They're in, it's Hatay, I think is the town where basically they were able to show that all the buildings that had been done pre-Erdogan era, most of them survived. Whereas the crappier ones built after Erdogan came in and sort of really controlled things, you were able to pay a little fine, a $300 fine, and then not really have to follow the code. And 8-story buildings just pancaking. Right now, I think and these cities, by the way, they're not small cities. These are developed, really densely populated cities out there. It's brutal. It's tough. And I feel terrible for them. It couldn't, they're nice people and they're hardworking people and, their government sucks. It's not Syria, to be fair. Right. But their government is not particularly responsive to it. All that stuff you see of cranes and everything else, that's mostly just Turks going and just doing it. Right. That kind of defines how Turkey is. They'll just go and the local builder doesn't wait for the government to pay him. He just grabs all his bulldozers and cranes and rushes over. The same guy who may have built the shitty building he's still out there trying to dig people out of the rock with his bare hands, you know? So,
yeah, he's got the equipment.
Yeah, it's tough.
Let's talk about what I really certainly definitely always want to talk with you about, which is about a year now since Russia invaded Ukraine. The New York Times put it this morning about their strategy. The war is almost a year old. It's clearly gone much worse than Vladimir Putin expected. Russia has gained control of Ukrainian territory in the east and south, but it's been rebuffed elsewhere. U.S. officials estimate that about 200,000 Russian troops have been wounded or killed. Still, even with all his failures, Vladimir Putin has reason to believe Russia's position might improve this year. He's relying on two dynamics. First, Russia is a much larger country with many more resources than Ukraine. Second, the war's outcome matters more to Ukraine and Russia than to Ukraine's foreign allies. That gap could ultimately cause Ukraine's allies to slow their supply of crucial weapons and equipment. Do you agree with that analysis?
No. I think the New York Times article is complete bullshit. I think it's terrible. And I hope I'm being blunt enough, by the way, to set up a...
Well, David Leonhardt wrote that. He's great.
He is, but that's the article that's got that little map that's got the red arrows, the pinchers going around the Donbass, like around Bakhmut.
Yep.
The New York Times, it's a case of both siderism. It's really actually a great case of both siderism, in that there's no story if you say the Russians are going to do another offensive and it's going to fail, right? And the reason it's going to fail, by the way, is I'll explain why very clearly. The Russians have lost more than half of the trucks they came into the war with, meaning that they don't have the trucks to carry the bullets and the bread and the men and the artillery shells to the front. And particularly, we talked about this before with the precision strike weapons we've given them. The Russians have lost half the trucks they came to the war with, and they have to keep their supplies a further 75 kilometers behind the lines than they did before. So you're still in a situation where Russia has to try to win a maneuver battle, right? Like they have to push the Ukrainians to break their lines and do what those sweet little arrows do in the New York Times article and cut off part of the Ukrainian line and then punch a hole and gain hundreds of kilometers, right? Have they done that anywhere since the first month of the war? No, none, not at all.
Well, they've called up 300,000 new troops this winter.
That's right. And the Ukrainians probably have about 1 million men under arms. Now, that includes militia, police, everything else. Ukraine is not short of men here at all. It's not like the Russians are 320,000. The Ukrainians are 100,000. There's probably about 250,000 Ukrainians facing them, right? With enough Ukrainians, by the way, to cover all of the Belarusian border, cover the Kharkiv, cover whatever. But the bottom line is this: that no one has solved for offense in this war, because in this war, there's tons of artillery. There's tons of drones. There's tons of satellite coverage, especially for the Ukrainian side, but also even for the Russian side. So to get a big breakthrough, right, what do you have to do? You have to concentrate all your tanks, concentrate all your men, punch a big hole, and then fan out behind that hole. Well, if an American satellite can literally count the license plate numbers on your tank, how do you do that big concentration and get away with that without getting artillery to death, right? The Ukrainians have sort of figured that out. A friend of mine calls it fog eating snow. They sort of accelerated attrition to the point where the Russians kind of fall apart. So Kherson, the Russians, there was no big maneuver battle that happened in Kherson. The Russians were just like, we just can't keep doing this because we're losing too many supplies and men. It's completely crazy. The Ukrainians literally let them go back over the river and leave Kherson. In Kharkiv, the Ukrainians reduced the Russians along the entire front so badly that the Russians had to bring those troops somewhere else. Again, not this big maneuver battle where tanks are rushing. It's not World War II. It's not Battle of the Bulge. We've never seen anything like that, right? It's always just been, on the Ukrainian side, them just accelerating the attrition to the point where the Russians just have to give up territory, right? The Russians have not even done that. They've sort of ground it out in a place like Bakhmut or in Vuhledar, like they just sort of grind out, and they literally grinding out 10 kilometers here and there with 20,000 artillery shells. There's so that those arrows again, which I keep going back to, which annoy me so much, they're describing a reality that we haven't seen at all in this war.
Well, Leonhardt writes.
Look at that article. Go ahead.
He also writes, U.S. officials remain skeptical that Russia's larger campaign to overrun eastern Ukraine will succeed, given the state of the Russian military. The troops called up in recent months are mostly inexperienced, and the war has already used up a lot of munitions and equipment. I think you kind of just said that.
Yeah. And you know, again, like they show that map that suggests there's big things coming for the Russians. At the same time, they're like, oh yeah, their guys aren't really trained, which is true. What we're looking at right now is Russia is trying to hit a political goal here, which is February 24th is coming up. Putin is trying to make things look good after a year of war, because what he really cares about more than anything is keeping his seat. And so the Russian army is just shoving everywhere as hard as it possibly can for the next 4 weeks or next 2 weeks. And they're going to get what they can get. And then they're going to kind of say, like, look how great we did, right? You know, this last big offensive. The problem with this is that they're going to burn up 150,000 of those 320,000 troops. And we have the Ukrainians getting better and better material, better tanks, better missiles, better everything. And I think that we are going to see the next offensive round from the Ukrainians in the spring or early summer. And so in other words, what I'm saying is, like, what we're looking at right now, somebody called it was great. Lawrence Friedman called it, this is the storm before the calm. Everyone's freaking out about this big, quote unquote, Russian offensive, which I think literally started 3 weeks ago. It's been that shitty that it's already been there going for a long time and no one really noticed it. And I think that they're going to gas themselves out again in the winter. And then I think we're going to see another repeat in the spring and summer of what we saw last summer and fall, where the Ukrainians are going to bite off one or two big more chunks again. So I am not, and to get at something you were saying, you know, I guess one of the things was like, is this more important to Ukraine and Russia than it is to the West? Of course it is. That being said, nobody who can look at a map who is involved in NATO doesn't look at this war and say, if you let the Russians win here, you're just fighting another war in 5 years or 3 years. There's no question about it. And if you're NATO, do you say, well, we'll fight for the Baltics? Yeah, right. Then you only have about 150 miles between the border and the ocean. And the Baltics are much harder to defend. It's a harder war to fight. So anyone who is not a jackass looks at this war and says, this is the efficient way to crush Russian revanchist imperialism for 10 or 15 years. And so, yeah, I think it's easy to say, well, you know, you're across the ocean or you're in Germany or whatever. This is important. This is crucially important, because it's also why, for instance, China is sort of rethinking Taiwan, right? Like, these things are all related.
What are the signs? What are the signs? I've been reading a little bit about that. What are the signs that China's rethinking, and you mean rethinking invading Taiwan?
Well, the signs that I saw were that the Chinese government was suddenly, they picked the former Chinese ambassador to the U.S. They kicked him up above a bunch of more senior people and made him the foreign minister in China. And he is sort of he's a managed competition guy. He's not a wolf warrior. So they literally made that guy in charge of their foreign policy, which, you know, when China makes somebody a foreign minister, that tells you where they're going.
Right.
They picked a guy who was much less aggressive. And, you know, he would go to basketball games in D.C. Like, he was a congenial guy here. Xi wanted to have a meeting with Blinken, which violates protocols, head of state with the Secretary of State. The balloon blew all this up. But China was obviously making at least gestures in the right direction.
Right.
And I think that it's obvious that if you're the Chinese military, for instance, which was built along Russian lines and hasn't fought a war since 77 or 78, where the Vietnamese kicked our ass, you have to look at this and say, the Russians haven't fought a major war in a really long time. Look at how bad they're doing. And they're fighting it in the Russian way, and we kind of fight that way. And look at how the American way of doing things just fucks these guys up, right? And so from both a diplomatic and a military perspective, you have to look at this for China and think, we have to really think this through. Now, I will tell you, in Washington, people really sound like they think that China's going to invade Taiwan.
Yeah.
People really are very pessimistic about that. And I hear it all the time, and I hear it from people across the spectrum. I'm more skeptical they will do it, but clearly there is a window of opportunity in about 3 years to about 5 years after that, where China will have some advantages that they will have to make a decision on whether they go while they have those advantages, or they decide not to, and then they lose them. And then I think the question, as a military question, is over at that point.
Why do you think, probably you don't think much about it, but it's interesting to think about how today's Republican Party is so pro-Russia and anti-Ukraine, and how quickly that changed. I think the easiest, most simple way to explain it is that today's Republican Party is pro-authoritarian, regardless of communism, regardless of anything else. They support the strong man, especially when it's a white, quote, Christian, anti-gay type thug that Putin is. Right. But they didn't used to support Putin. So, it's just a bizarre thing that today's Republican Party does not support Ukraine and does support Russia in many ways.
Well, we should be careful, though, to say it's not the entire Republican Party. It's a section, the MAGA section of the GOP.
I mean, a huge part. And as I always 40%. Look at it, a very large part of the biggest names in right-wing media, Tucker Carlson, many others, right. Steve Bannon, I think, is several of the other main, maybe not Hannity or something, but I think that matters because where they go, Republicans follow. But you're right. I mean, in Congress, but I bet you if you ask the average registered Republican or state representative, I mean, it's insidious pervasive throughout the party.
So I have seen polling on this about a month ago, but still, and something like 60% of Republicans still wanted us to support Ukraine. It was like 85% of Democrats, and it was about 75% of independents. So it's not, I think that's one of those things that's stickier, that the attitude towards Russia, particularly amongst older voters who remember the Soviet Union. I think there's a lot of stickiness there.
Well, it matters, though. Doesn't it matter if the ones that hold the purse strings are against it, because they're the ones that could potentially end the funding of support.
And the guy who holds the purse strings the most in the GOP is Mitch McConnell. Did you see his tie at the State of the Union?
No.
Big yellow and blue stripes.
Interesting.
Down the tie. He couldn't have screamed, "I'm supporting Ukraine," any harder.
Got it.
And I was again in another conversation I was having recently about this, and I was saying there's sort of like a reactionary international, right? Sort of like the Soviet International or the Communist Internationals back in the day. And it's people like Orban. It's people like the head of Austria, obviously Putin, obviously Lukashenko. And in the U.S., there's a lot of the sort of, politically dark intellectual web guys who all are down with this. And really what it is they just have, as you said, that affinity for each other. Putin it's Caesarism. Putin's going to come in, or Trump is going to come in, and they're going to sweep away all of the things that get in, all those pesky democratic things that get in the way of us just getting shit done. And that was 100% the 1930s, and that is what those guys are now. But here's what's super interesting. In the U.S., that guy lost. In Brazil, that guy lost. In Serbia, that guy lost. In Croatia, that guy lost. The Russians were trying to do a coup. Oh, my God, I want to say Montenegro, and that's the wrong place. We're in Transnistria, Moldova. They were trying to do a coup, and what they're getting instead is the interior minister, who's a pro-democracy, hardcore pro-West guy, is going to take over and is going to crush them.
That also happened in Ukraine in 2014, if we want to go back.
Exactly. So I think the tide has turned. It's just hard to see.
Yeah.
Because there was so much going wrong here that we didn't pay attention to it. But it's definitely things I think could obviously go wrong again. But I'll tell you, if the Democrats win the White House in 2024, I think a lot of things change, because I think that sets the track away from that sort of politics pretty strongly.
Okay, last question to you is, have you been paying attention to latest on investigations into former disgraced president of the United States?
You're talking about Bill Clinton, or?
Are there any investigations into him? Jesus.
I'm sure there's something. I'm sure
Man,
there's some.
He's quiet as a
I'm sure
mouse.
there's some Republican committee that is still holding out hope.
Nobody wants Bill Clinton at anything. Like you could open a new, shake and whatever that Shake Shack, and he'd be like, "You want me to come over?" I'm like, "No, we're good.
I'll come over and hang out with the ladies out back at the Friar." Yeah, he is not exactly popular around here these days, but I have watched a little bit. I think we're at the shit or cut bait. I don't know if that's a phrase thing or part of this, where I think that Thursday when they release parts of the grand jury investigation in Georgia, that apparently that is going to talk about how some witnesses lied to the grand jury and they can prove it. I would imagine one of those witnesses is probably has initials like, Mark Meadows. Mm-hmm. So I think, and then you've got this guy, Jack Smith, who's doing the DOJ investigation, and he's apparently quite a busy bee these days. Yeah,
that's what I've been.
Because in the past, I got burned enough times where people were like, your buddy Glenn Kirshner, this is the time. Dino Vidala, here it's going to be, it's going to be over. Katie Fang, all these people have predicted so many fucking times that this is the thing. I honestly think we're now at the point where it is the thing. They're either going to have enough evidence to definitely nail him, or they won't, and that's it. And I don't go with the idea that Merrick Garland blew it or whatever. I think these are hard things to do, and given the prosecutor in Georgia seems pretty fucking kick-ass, and Smith seems pretty kick-ass.
Yep.
I'm going to wait to see what they say and what they do, and I think if they don't decide to prosecute, it means there wasn't enough of a case. And if they do, I think Trump is going to get knocked out, and we might come to regret that politically just a little bit.
How?
Because Trump is so incredibly beatable in 2024, it's not even funny.
Right.
So.
Good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
As always, my friend, lots of great questions from me and great answers from you, if I do say so myself.
Thank you, sir. The questions were fantastic.
Thank you. I thought long and hard about them. I knew what I wanted to talk to you about, and we covered it all. Thank you, sir.
Great.
All right, there he goes. Bill B. in D.C. Always great to talk to him. Always learn a lot from him. Man, I don't know how he learns so much and then can just regurgitate it like that, but he really is one of the best. And now more credible people than me are asking for his expertise, which I think is pretty cool. If he wants to tell us about that at the Hangout, which hopefully he'll be there Thursday night, then he can. All right. Well, very excited now to welcome my second guest. He is the founder and president of the Public Religion Research Institute, which is an independent research institute at the intersection of religion, culture, and public policy. He is the author of a really, really great book you should definitely get. This is one of the best and most important books I've read in a long time. White Too Long. And you can read him every week at his Substack, robertpjones.substack.com. All right, there he is. I've got him now. Just told you all about him. Very excited to have Robbie Jones back. Thank you, sir, for joining me again.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be back.
You are continuing to do really, really important work. I love that you're teaming up with Kristen Dumez, who I just had on the show for the first time. She's a huge hit, as well as Jamar Tisby, who I've become a big fan of as well. You guys are all combining your Substack, and it's a fantastic thing you're doing to talk about this new survey that your organization has done on Christian nationalism. Let me just start there. Different people have different definitions of Christian nationalism to some extent, right?
Yeah, that's right. And what we were up to we did this study and teamed up between the PRRI teams and the Brookings Institution teams, and we were really trying to get a good quantification of just how big a problem is this? Who is it in the country, that believes these basic tenets? And so, in order to do that with the survey, you have to have some definitions. So we set out to try to do that.
Your definition, one way that you put it, is Christian nationalism is a new term for a worldwide view worldview that has been with us since the founding of our country. The idea that America is destined to be a promised land for European Christians. While most Americans today embrace pluralism and reject this anti-democratic claim, 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants and most Republicans remain animated by the vision of a white Christian America? I know this is obvious. You've answered this both regularly at Substack, at PRRI, in your book. Why is that so dangerous to American democracy?
Well, I mean, it's fundamentally anti-democratic. When we measured this in the survey, I mean, we were asking pretty hard questions to get right at this. Questions like, I could give you a couple of examples. God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society, or the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American, or U.S. law should be based on Christian values. So these are attitudes that are really, fundamentally opposed to the idea of a pluralistic democracy. It really is more of a theocratic, view of the country. So I think that it's dangerous, both for the country and frankly, it's dangerous for Christians who really care about their own faith. I mean, this is really not a biblical, way of thinking about the Christian faith either.
Why?
It really is about political dominion and power, which is something that's pretty antithetical. If you read, as I grew up calling, the Bible, I had those red letters right in the New Testament that were actually the words of Jesus. Pretty hard to pull out this idea of exercising dominion over people who talked, from someone who talked about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek.
It's a pretty strong point. By the way, did you pay any attention to? Do you have any thoughts on those ads that we all saw in the Super Bowl? The Jesus didn't want us to fight ads, or what they were?
Yeah, I mean, they're a little slippery, I think. And you watch them and you think, oh, that's okay. Love your enemies, right? It kind of ends with, but. I mean, part of the problem, I think, is there was this equating, or at least for me, like one thing, there was this equating of just all conflict is bad, which means that people on both sides, no matter what they're fighting for, are the same, right? And, I, for one, think we ought to be making some judgments about insurrectionists on the one hand, fighting to overthrow the government, and people standing up for the movement for Black Lives, for example.
Right. I was talking with my parents about those ads this morning, and I think my dad was like, what was so wrong with them? I mean, I didn't really pay attention, but what was so wrong with them? I was like, well, it creates a false equivalency. It's like, why are the black people yelling in these photos?
Right.
Not for no reason, for the same reason they have been upset at this injustice for forever in this country, and the other side is the one that's holding them back to some extent. I mean, I'm minimizing it, but it creates this false equivalency. Those ads, I felt like can't we just get along? And it's like, yeah, stop treating me lesser than, and then we can.
No, that's right. Yeah, I think that's dead on. I mean, the fight for injustice and for equality, yeah, those are not the same, as fights for dominion.
Let's talk more about what your poll and the survey found. It was really well done. You had 6,000 people in this survey that you did with Brookings. What do you say to people on Twitter who I've been sharing this with? They're like, I don't believe polls.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think all polls are not created equal. I think it's absolutely right to kind of, say, well, to ask that question, why should we, think this poll is legitimate? And the biggest thing to look at is the methodology. One of the things that we try to do with every poll we put out at PRRI is we're very transparent about how we created a sample, who we interviewed. The entire questionnaire is up on the website. Like, you could download the entire script that people were asked, see what questions were asked, how they were asked, and importantly, what order they were asked in, what the response options were, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it really is about looking at the quality of, so this was a random probability sample. I mean, everyone in the country had an equal chance of being recruited for the study. And then, you could actually see exactly how the questions were worded in there. So I think that transparency is a real key. And then the quality of the sample is really the other thing.
It's really fascinating and terrifying what you found, the results of this, and we can break it down into different things. But you found all kinds of things. You're looking at age, over 50, under 50, who people, what they believe, gender, education. And then there was things the conclusions like anti-immigrant views, specifically anti-Muslim. It gets more confusing or complex with anti-Semitism. You find out about these ideas of patriarchal gender roles and subservience to the man in the family and so on. Pick any of the outcomes that you found there and tell me a little bit more if you want.
Well, one of the things we wanted to do in this survey was to really understand the way that these views of Christian nationalism fit with other ideologies that are particularly on the political right. So we did look at anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim views, anti-immigrant views, and patriarchal gender roles. The first thing to say is that there's a positive correlation between Christian nationalism and all of those things, right? So Christian nationalism it's not a set of views that just sits in a vacuum. It's actually quite interconnected with these other movements. So just to say it plainly, like the more likely you are to believe in those things, like the U.S. law should be based on Christianity, the more likely you are to deny the existence of systemic racism, the more likely you are to hold anti-immigrant views, for example.
Nearly 7 in 10 Christian nationalism adherents, 69%, agree that the husband is the head of the household in a, quote, truly Christian family, and his wife submits to his leadership, compared to only 33% of all Americans. Wow.
Yeah, I think that's right. We had a number of questions that I think the other thing asking to equality polls is, on each of these vectors, we asked 3, 4, 5 questions so that it's not just one cherry-picked question. You could see this pattern over and over again. You read that one. Another one that jumps out to me in the same area is society as a whole has become too soft and feminine. Do you agree or disagree with that question? Right. And again, 7 in 10, or 2/3 of Christian nationalism adherents agree with that statement compared to less than 4 in 10 Americans. So this sense, and what holds all this together really, and one easy way of understanding this is this real sense of hierarchy, right? And it is the thing across all of these things. There is this kind of very rigid world that's made up of hierarchies. And at the top of that hierarchy is white Christian men, right, that sit right at the top. And everyone else kind of finds their way in one way or the other somewhere down the pyramid from there.
Really, really important. All of the conclusions of this poll, this survey, is really, really important. All of your work is very important. I feel like the most dangerous, pernicious, terrifying statistic, and I've heard this from a number of different surveys, from Gallup, I think I used to cite, or maybe it was a Pew survey from several years ago, and it seems to have only gotten worse. But your poll found 85% of white Americans who strongly embrace Christian nationalism believe discrimination against white Americans is as big of a problem as discrimination against Black Americans and other minorities, compared with 40% of all Americans. 85% think that discrimination against white Americans is as big of a problem as discrimination against Black Americans and other minorities. And apparently, as I was talking to Tim Wise, who's a historian of such things, this is actually not a new point of view or opinion of a certain subset of Americans. That's probably fair to say, but it seems to have gotten even worse. Is that accurate?
We've been asking this question for a while. It has ticked up slightly over the last 10 years, to be sure. But it is this expression of racial resentment is really what it comes down to. And you can see it in some of our immigration questions as well. We have a question about, so-called replacement theory, which you've heard on Fox News and being touted, this idea that immigrants are replacing so-called true Americans. And there is this, so I think there is this kind of politics of resentment that is all about kind of protecting America, and true Americans from those who are seen as other, right? And who are seen as other? It's really people who are not white and Christian. It is protecting this view of a kind of white Christian America. And it is fairly old. And I think the people that are embracing it today don't always realize the roots of those things. I mean, this is the vision, for example, of the KKK, right? We forget that the KKK was not just anti-Black. We tend to think about that piece of it, but the positive vision that the KKK that they were putting forward and selling membership on was the idea of protecting a Protestant Christian Gentile, right, kind of America. So that's why Jews and Catholics did not fit in the vision that the KKK was putting forward.
See, this article I'm reading about, article from Andrew White at RNS, Religion News Service, based on this survey, and he talks about the reason to add white before Christian nationalism. He says, these findings underscore why many social scientists add white when talking about Christian nationalism. The desire to see a particular expression of Christianity privileged in the public sphere and preserved by the government operates differently for white and Black Americans. What would you add to that?
I think that's right. We took some care in the survey, actually. We were crafting the measures of Christian nationalism. We took some care not to include any questions that had anything to do with race or racial identity. So it was really just about Christianity in those measures. But then when we measured them against, these attitudes about race, racial resentment, denials of the existence of systemic racism, then we clearly see those who are white and identify as white looking different, even among that group of Christian nationalists. So while there are some people of color who identify with those Christian nationalist views, when it comes to fueling resentment, fueling violence, it looks quite different in that group than it does about white Americans. And perhaps one of the scariest findings in the study for me was we had a survey experiment where we actually allowed people to kind of pick this question, where we asked people indirectly whether they believed the statement that the country is a white Christian country and I am willing to fight to keep it that way. And we have an estimated 17% of Americans, that's nearly 1 in 5, saying that they agree with that statement, that the country is a white Christian country, not just Christian, but white Christian country, and willing to fight to keep it that way.
Yeah, I saw that part of the survey in your presentation, and I meant to recall that, but these were statements do you kind of agree or disagree with? And to hear you say it again, I'm like, I don't know what could be a more overt admission of what they believe about whiteness, about race in this case, in terms of what their aspiration is, than that statement that you perfectly crafted for them to either agree or disagree with. It is probably the most telling and important point that was raised. And obviously, yeah, as you said, the most terrifying as well. And I think it's all evidence. So much of this is evidence as to why we need to be better educated, which is why it's so disconcerting that we're seeing this trend against education. When you read these statistics, 2/3 of white Americans who strongly embrace Christian nationalism disagree that white supremacy is still a major problem, compared with 1/3 of all Americans. Just over 80% of white Americans who strongly embrace Christian nationalism disagree that generations of slavery and discrimination make for an uneven playing field for black Americans, compared with 45% of all Americans. It contributes to this idea that, as you say, that we still have a long way, real barriers to how we collectively remember and choose to respond to the historical injustices faced by black Americans. We have real barriers, and we acknowledge that. And yet, on the other end, in my district and in districts across the country, they're trying to get rid of books written by our greatest authors and also our greatest black authors, from James Baldwin to Maya Angelou to Toni Morrison to, even To Kill a Mockingbird, which has become, I know, problematic to some extent.
Biographies of Roberto Clemente, for God's sake.
The Giving Tree. What's next? It's so. What are your thoughts on that? Those efforts in places like Florida, that's getting a lot of attention, but it's happening all over the country, to, get rid of advanced placement African-American history. Doesn't that contribute directly to people not knowing how terrible it has been?
Well, I may give you something of a surprising answer on this one. I actually see in those what seem to be fairly desperate measures, right? When you're removing books from libraries, especially these kinds of books we're talking about, right? These are, America's literary treasures in many cases that they're getting pulled from the shelves of our kids in public schools in places like Florida. These are desperate measures. And what I think is happening is the silver lining, I think, in this survey is that it does show that by a margin of 2-1, Americans reject this idea of Christian nationalism, right? This is not the country that most Americans want to live in. They want to live in a pluralistic country that embraces democracy and diversity. That's the America they want to live in. But there is this third, right, that is trying desperately to hang on. And where they have their hands on the levers of power, I think they realize, right, the country is moving quickly in this other direction. So they are kind of pulling with all their might, this kind of last-ditch effort, I think, to kind of forestall what seems to be the inevitable thing. You mentioned age. We see this kind of break here, and it is the under 50, over 50 break where you see the big divide, right? And Americans under the age of 50 are, overwhelmingly reject this world.
I'm glad to hear that, but then you read Kristen's work, Jesus and John Wayne, and you wonder how hard it is to radicalize a young man in America with just a book or a website or a video. And you worry about that because you want to think that these ideas are dying with the people who hold them. But ideas are renewed to the next generation. We certainly see a lot of young white supremacists. And you just wonder how hard it is to radicalize them, given the nature of our media and how accessible it is to find any kind of leader of hate that you want, and then feel like you've been seen, like you're a member now of some type of movement.
Well, I think particularly this politics of resentment I was talking about, is the kind of gateway, right, of saying, if you're white and you're Christian, you're under threat. The government's after you. The FBI is after you. Just kind of ginning up this kind of, fear of persecution, and I think at the same time, this awareness that is true, that the numbers, right, of white Christians are dropping in the country. You and I have talked about this before, right? The numbers today, you had to take all white Christians together. They're only 42% of the country today. That's never been true, except in the last decade of this country's history, right? Even go back to 2008, when our first African-American president was elected, the country was 54% white and Christian. Today it's 42%. Right. So there is this sense that the country is changing. I think that's why this desperation, why we're seeing a lot of this now, is there is this kind of last effort, last stand kind of mentality. But that is also the mentality that is ripe for recruiting people into kind of desperate, for a desperate cause like that.
Over at your Substack, I'm not sure if this is where it was originally, but it's this beautiful piece about the death of Tyree Nichols, Living into Lament, a white response.
Yeah, it was there originally, yeah.
And you include your thoughts and a whole bunch of black voices, current ones, as well as people like W.E.B. Du Bois. You end it, though, with your own words. You say, do take the opportunity to see the world through his eyes, Tyree's eyes. Tyree's vision, his story, and his life have been cut short by police violence. It is right to lament with the psalmist. Am I pronouncing that right? Psalmist?
Yep.
How long, O Lord? But it is also necessary for white folk to feel the losses upon losses enough to decide they matter, enough that we speak up and demand change. I thought that was beautiful, and I thought maybe you would add a little bit to it about because your own journey and why this is so important.
Well, I will say a little bit about that. I wrote that piece because I realized how easy it is for people who look like you or I to sort of go, oh, that's terrible, right? And we hear some news like this, but then just kind of turn the page and move on and go throughout our day. And what I found is that, my African-American friends, it stopped them in their tracks. Like their week was, they were just lost in the grief, right? And just to realize the differential way in which I had the option to just not let it sink in that deeply, right? Because my kids don't look like that, right? And that's what it comes down to, I think, is it just doesn't hit home in the same way, right? If you're a black mother or a black father and you could see your own kids, right, in these stories, and you've had that experience yourself, it really isn't the same. And so it was just me trying to kind of raise those voices up and sit with them enough. I think for myself, I really wasn't a preachy piece at all. It was really about trying to make myself slow down enough to take it in and make it real in a way that I think is often hard for people who are white to do, because we can just stay arm's length distance from that stuff.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that, I see that, I find myself doing it too often, and I just think that that's why it's so important that you wrote it so beautifully put, and even more important that you're living it each day with your work. I can't thank you enough for joining me, and keep up the great work. And I hope everybody, if they're not already following you, will go and follow and support you. You're doing this really cool series with others in your lane, and I'm just so thankful and grateful to have you joining me. I really appreciate learning from you.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm glad to be here. Let me just plug Jamar Tisby's Substack footnotes, and Kristen DeMay's Substack is Connections on both on Substack, and we are doing this kind of round robin virtual roundtable this week. We'll be wrapping it up.
Yeah, I've been following Kristen, of course, you, and I'm really excited to be learning more about Jamar. His work is really great. You know what? As a matter of fact, I think I'll include a piece that he shared, some of his comments from your gathering last week, I think it was, to wrap it up here right now.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Robbie. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Good to see you.
All right, and here they are now, as promised, the comments from Jamar Tisby at the Christian Nationalism at the Brookings Institute the other day, where Robbie was, Kristen Dumez, E.J. Dion was, and I just think this is a very powerful, almost 8 minutes I want to share with you here at the end.
So we're going to go on a journey. It's going to be okay. We're going to be dealing with some hard facts, but we'll do it together. How's that? All right. So with that preamble, let me make this statement. White Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. White Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. These data back it up. I define Christian nationalism as an ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. An ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. Lots of different definitions out there, many of them very good. That's just how I think of it. As we look at these most recent findings, one particular aspect stood out to me as a historian of race and religion, and it was this part. It says, there are minimal differences in adherence to Christian nationalism beliefs by race. Minimal differences. Rates of support for Christian nationalism are roughly the same among white Americans, about 30% lean, and black Americans, about 30% lean toward Christian nationalism. And I said, that's interesting, given the racial implications and ramifications of Christian nationalism. How could it be that there are minimal differences by race? And then I thought about it. Two things came up. One, there has always been some cooperation of the oppressed with the oppressor. This is how you get the trope of the Uncle Tom, right? It's the idea that you betray your own community and take sides with the dominant power. So that's always the case in whatever kind of oppression you're dealing with. But secondly, Black Americans as a group are a highly religious group. On average, most Americans believe in God or a higher power. According to a Pew Research study in 2021, 97% of Black Americans believe in God or a higher power. And the vast majority of those folks are Christian, Protestant at that. So it wouldn't surprise us that this language of God and country resonates with Black people. The difference is, what do we mean? What do we mean by those words? I contrast white Christian nationalism with Black Christian patriotism. Nationalism and patriotism. Let me give you one example. Last night, we heard the State of the Union, and if you had your caffeine going, you heard the response to the State of the Union from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the new governor of Arkansas. She ran against Chris Jones, a Black man with a Ph.D. from MIT. What's so interesting about those two figures is that they both ran what I call faith-forward campaigns. They foregrounded their Christian faith. They're both children of preachers. They both adhere to Christianity. Chris Jones is a minister. And yet what they meant when they looked at the intersection between faith and politics was very different. Just broadly speaking, when you talk about white Christian nationalism, it tends toward a rigid, narrow, authoritarian kind of politics. when you're talking about Black Christian patriotism, it tends toward an expansive, flexible, inclusive kind of politics. And so it's not just the words people use, it's the ramifications of what they mean by those words. Now, you've heard me say a couple of times white Christian nationalism. I think Christian nationalism is a perfectly appropriate term. Takes less time to say. But I don't want us to forget the white in the white Christian nationalism part. That is to say, we cannot overlook the racial dimensions of Christian nationalism. Dr. Jones pointed some of that out. I'll just remind us that as we see resurgence of what we're now calling white Christian nationalism, that tends to happen around times when Black rights are expanding. So we can look at sort of the most notorious group that represents white Christian nationalism. And if you never thought of them in these terms, I think it'll be appropriate. The Ku Klux Klan first arose in the 1860s. What happened then? Emancipation after the Civil War. They got real active again in the 1950s and 60s. What was going on then? A civil rights movement where Black people were pushing for more civil rights. But perhaps the most widespread and virulent form happened in the Jim Crow era. What was going on then? Coincided in 1915 with this film, The Birth of a Nation, which mythologized and romanticized the founding of the Klan and of a white Christian, mainly Protestant America. So, in conclusion, white Christian nationalism is not only the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today, to put a finer point on it, white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to a multiracial, inclusive democracy and a diverse church in the United States today. Thank you.
All right. That is Jemar Tisby, and I think every word was worth it and a great way to wrap up my conversation with Robbie Jones. Thank you to Robbie Jones. Thank you to Bill B. in D.C. Thank you to you for listening to today's episode of Stand Up. I'm here each and every day. Looking forward to sharing tomorrow my new latest guest in my Gen series, the Gen Z series. Her name is Hope Moses. She is a junior journalism major at Marquette University in Milwaukee and comes highly recommended from our favorite intern producer, Odessa, who met her when she was a student at Marquette, I think is how they met, right? Anyway, that's a really great conversation, and tomorrow I will share that with you. Thank you so much for listening today. Go review the podcast. Rate it and review it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe on Instagram and youtube.com/standupwithpete. And, of course, support with a paid subscription if you haven't already at standupwithpete.com. Podcast is free, but I cannot do it without you because it costs a lot of time and resources. So sign up now, standupwithpete.com, and I'll talk to you right here tomorrow.